Lesson 5 of the video lessons. We're looking today at Nazism in the 1920s. This is another one which tends not to get asked in and of itself. There's nothing to stop them. It's very famous how far was a Nazi regime, the Nazi party, a fringe irritant before 1923. Question of LXL, for example. But in reality, the focus on this question is more about using this as evidence of later questions, particularly why did Hitler come to power? And we can see throughout the Nazis in the 1920s evidence for all our paragraphs for why did Hitler come to power and why did the Nazis do so well in elections. And you could argue that to some extent the groundwork laid in the 1920s led to the successes of the 1930s. So let's just go through the story nice and easily. If we're going to break up into sort of 4 simple areas, we've got the early years, 1919 to 23, where the Nazi party is one of many in Bavaria and slowly grows over time. To the point of the Munich Putsch. We then have the Beer Hall Putsch, which is an abject failure, and Hitler is put in prison. It's, for all intents and purposes, it seems like the party is dead. And then we see Hitler change course and starting to rebuild a party that can win elections. And although in a key message of his lesson, he is a failure to achieve electoral success in this period before the Great Depression, you can argue he builds the machine to take advantage of a crisis when it finally emerges. And the very important thing, therefore, to do is to question whether or not the running beforehand made a difference for the eventual Great Depression. I.e., had the Great Depression happened but the rebuilding not happened, would Hitler have come to power? And the answer, quite clearly, as we shall see, is no. It was required a party machine to take advantage of it, and that party machine was built in the early years. Likewise, when we move on to 29 to 33, we see a much more polished, much bigger, much more national profile party, which at the same time is always struggling with internal issues, with the left wing of the party not quite happy with the directions that things are going, but Hitler just keeping them happy enough by saying when they get in power it will all be different. Obviously that promise is not really felt through, and this is why we have, or at least one of the contributing reasons for, the problems that lead to the Beer Hall Putsch. So the obligatory background, now none of us will be tested, and I tend not to like it because we focus very much on psychology. Obviously Hitler was an Austrian, wanted to be an artist, didn't succeed, obviously was had a standard, no exciting views of someone of his period, of his time, of his background. His first real connection with Germany, although if we're going to talk about it, Austria, dialect German-speaking people, they arguably are a Germanic people and were only separate from Germany because of internal politics of Germany and a guy called Bismarck during the reunification. He was, for all intents and purposes, seemingly a successful soldier. He won medals. He established his beliefs about nationalism, authoritarianism, and anti-Semitism. And again, none of this really put him out of place to anyone else. He did not have a particularly inspiring sort of road to Damascus moment. Now, when he comes back to Bavaria, he stays with the army and he helps put down a rising. And his political reliability is shown quite a lot by his appointment as a political officer and then as essentially a spy, someone whose job is on behalf of the Bavarian army, Bavaria being the southwestern province of Germany and very Catholic and traditionalist area, spying on the various socialist or political groups in the area. And eventually he comes into contact with DAP, the German Deutschen Arbeiten Party, or the German Workers' Party, and joins quite shortly. And very quickly, because of his skills as a beer hall speaker, now very important, Bavaria and Munich is full of beer halls, sort of loud tent or loud big hall things with lots of entertainment in the middle, but most people sat along trestle tables drinking beer and talking amongst themselves. To succeed in this environment, you need to be a rabble rouser. You don't need 4-point solutions which are very logically put out. You don't need rhetoric. You need to be able to grab people with your energy, grab people's attention and tell them what they want to hear. And Hitler does very well in this environment and very quickly becomes a shadow leader, drawing up the 25-point plan, the core ideological document, and becoming the star involved. Now, as time goes on, Drexler, the true leader of DAP, gets concerned and starts trying to edge Hitler out. Hitler throws a strop, essentially, knowing that he is the most powerful, most popular and charismatic speaker, and to which the success of the NSDAP relies on, and Drexler allows him to become chairman. Drexler very quickly is edged out as time goes on. So, what happens in the 1920s? Now, the first thing he does is he starts developing his part of the NSDAP to become the first amongst the many different right-wing parties. As I mentioned before, there's around 68 to 70 extreme right-wing nationalist groups in Bavaria at the time. They are no different. However, you can argue the way that the party is structured does set it apart from the rest. It's more disciplined, more organised, and its popular speaker brings in more people, which means more money, more membership, higher profile, which then leads to the same events and the same image that helps you get more success. The essay we'll talk about on the next slide, but he organises the essay. We see the first Nazi newspaper published in 1921 to sort of develop the Nazi message. Streicher, who ran another right-wing party, joins the Nazis and pretty much doubles the membership by bringing his party in there. And his big coup was to get Hermann Goering, someone who's going to cause all manner of problems as time goes on, to join. Goering is a war hero, is also a member of high society. He therefore connects Hitler and brings the Nazis a degree of sort of celebrity and respectability. This is very important, and you can argue that Hitler's ability to bring Goering in, Goering doesn't really believe in much apart from sort of crude anti-Semitism and crude anti-communism, is very important, at least in the short term. And so by 1922, the membership is about 20,000, and the Nazis are one of the, or the NSDAP as it's known, is one of the sort of largest influential parties of the extreme right, but it's still a relatively minor force. However, in the relative world of Munich politics, is quite important, and it's not unimpressive the amount they've managed to change. Now let's talk about the SA very briefly, obviously the stormtroopers. Now, these were a group of men, uniformed men, initially aimed as almost semi-bouncers. Communists and other right-wing groups would try and raid the meetings of their political rivals, and therefore, if you go to the Nazis and you have a chance of being beaten up, you tend not to go to their meetings anymore. It's designed to sort of stop that sort of ground level support and just register disdain towards the enemy. So the essay was designed to protect the meetings, and they were quite successful. And you can argue that at being one of the few organisations with a highly effective and sort of essay movement compared to the other right-wing Bavarian parties, this instantly makes the Nazis more sort of attractive. Because if you are a shoemaker in Munich and you want to go and hear a right-winger speak, and there's one party, the NSDAP, who you ain't going to get beaten up by attending the meeting, and there's another party where you can't be so sure, then naturally you are going to gravitate to ones which doesn't get you punched in the face. And so we can see the essay really provide that safe space, which then encourages people to draw to it. Over time, it is then used offensively to attack communist meetings, communist groups, and this very much helps up the profile of the Nazis. Not only are they attacking communists, obviously that's popular, but the fact that they are able to organise a uniform and disciplined and seemingly effective organisation such as the SA shows their sort of authoritarian streak and shows their sort of superiority to the other relatively badly organised Bavarian groups. So the SA, at least in the short term, is very helpful to gather those tens or hundreds of supporters at that low level, local politics level. Its leader is Ernst Röhm, is overwhelmingly a working class, and therefore overwhelmingly the socialist aspect, and it always supports the socialist elements of the ideology as we spoke about it before. Therefore, it particularly has a presence up north because Bavaria, outside of, say, Munich, doesn't have too much of a working class community. And its community is far more rural, whereas sort of in this sort of industrial towns, particularly Berlin, the working class members, and also the need for an SA, because obviously they are very, very communist areas, increases, and therefore we see much more of a left-wingness in those areas. And throughout this period, Berlin will be a left-wing area, and the left party will have its base in the north and have its base amongst the SA. This is a problem because if your armed force or your fighting forces against the leadership, this can cause problems. It's because it is a working class organisation, and because its ideology is sort of Nazi, but never 100% following the Nazi line, particularly as time goes on, they tend to be quite poorly disciplined. They tend to follow their leaders as opposed to party leadership. With the exception of Hitler, pretty much any other leader in the Nazi party is seen as an empty suit, not a real man, an opportunist, and lesser than that of, say, the other SA figures. Arguably, even by 1932-33, there's even mutterings that, and particularly by 1934, mutterings that even Hitler is not a true man, a true, sort of honest National Socialist, and he's sold out to the rich. So therefore, they are incredibly useful, particularly in the early years, but throughout this period, there'll be a liability as well. Because while violence in targeted, effective ways can be helpful, defending meetings, showing that you're beating up communists, they are never organised or disciplined enough to not beat up other people, not cause chaos, not to make the party look bad. And so constantly throughout this period, you've got these people who Hitler are trying to rein in, trying to keep in line. And you can say Hitler's ability both to stop the excesses of the SA violence from attacking people who are politically unpopular to attack. So if you beat up priests, for example, the SA being that socialistic, being that sort of working class, tend not to be as religious. That by avoiding that, that's very effective. But also Hitler's ability to keep this rebellious wing of the party happy and in the party without splitting it, because obviously if the Nazis split, the party will be doomed and won't win the elections. It's quite impressive in and of itself. And so throughout this, I'll be mentioning Hitler's ability to keep the SA in line. It's vitally important to realise that it's not just a split between left and right. If all the money is in the right, and that gives them strength, but arguably more members, and certainly the violent members, and the members who can do the whole Nazi party's reputation harm, are on the left, and therefore they are actually a genuine threat. They can use force to take over the party, although it's unlikely as time goes on. More true earlier on, but also they can do all sorts of damage to their reputation if they decide to totally ignore what Hitler asked them to. So this progress sort of continues. Hitler is a large party, and then we have the year of hyperinflation. We have the Cap Putsch, which to some extent is quite popular. We haven't had 1922, Mussolini's March on Rome, where similar fascist squads marched on Rome and Mussolini was appointed leader. Now, I actually have a chunk of video lessons on Italy if you're interested, but essentially the reasons that happened was more because the elites wanted Mussolini, not because Mussolini was effective. But nonetheless, Hitler decides that he is going to make a putsch on the sort of Republic of Weimar state. It is seen as weakened by hyperinflation, it's losing support by hyperinflation, and therefore it's seen as ripe for takeover. And Hitler believes that what he can do is march his supporters from Munich after seizing some arms and march them up to Berlin, and much like the Cap Putsch, which we looked at previously, seize power without much bloodshed. The elites won't stand in the way. Hitler will crown himself dictator and he'll win. Now, in reality, this is a shambles. It was poorly organised. The people who promised they would help him, the Bavarian sort of governor, von Kahr, and von Lossow, the Bavarian head of the army, who promised they wouldn't stop him, actually ended up stopping him. Von Kahr's going to end up being shot, by the way, by the Nazis in the Night of Long Knives. As well as this, clearly this had no chance of success. The biggest factor being that hyperinflation was pretty much cleared up by this point. Arguably, Hitler knew that von Kahr wasn't going to help him and knew that the situation economically had changed, and therefore he's far less likely to be successful. But he continued with it anyway because he's essentially organised all his troops. He's organised particularly all his SA, and they aren't going to respect his leadership, and they might even depose him if he then suddenly calls it off. So he's almost forced into this irresistible action. It does not go well. There's a shootout. 4 police officers are killed. A number of Nazis are killed. Hitler is put on trial. Now, interestingly, and we'll talk about this in more detail, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the judiciary, but essentially, Hitler has as his judge, a judge he's had before, who last time Hitler had him, this right-wing, very conservative judge who approved of the Nazis' actions against the communists, even if, like most elites, he didn't actually have much of a taste for what the Nazis actually did. He treated Hitler very, very nicely. Not only did he treat him nicely, he then wrote gave him the minimum sentence and then wrote personally to the appeal court asking for an even lower sentence. So Hitler knew straight away that he was going to get off. There's a debate whether von Kahr enabled this to happen or else someone else sort of trouble within who had power behind the scenes in Weimar or Bavarian politics enabled Hitler to get an easy ride, or this was just luck. I mean, it sounds like it couldn't be luck, but in reality, there's so many sympathetic judges on the judiciary, as spoken about before, that it could well have been. And in reality, the trial becomes used as a massive propaganda opportunity. The Hitler, who is a nobody outside of Munich, and even then he's only in certain areas of Munich, suddenly people want to know who this man is who tried to do a putsch against Germany. And he has most of the national papers, particularly conservative ones, who are willing to almost make a point against Weimar and write down anyone's word who says bad things about Weimar, are basically reporting him word for word. So he ends up making quite a number of relatively good speeches, which are printed very well and printed across conservative newspapers. And this really raises Hitler's profile. This is very important because with that profile, Hitler will then, when he comes out of prison, be a national figure and a national name. Being a national figure, being a national name, and having that sort of control to some extent over his image, he will then leverage as time goes on to become more popular. And people will, when he speaks again and when he comes out and speaks to 27, he will have more of a brand than some random who happened to be in Bavaria. So you can argue that this certainly helped him. Now, he was imprisoned for 5 years in the most comfortable type of prison you could get, a sort of prison called Landsberg, where he was allowed as an assistant, he was allowed unlimited visitors, he was allowed to write his own book. And he writes a book called Mein Kampf. Now, obviously, this is to some extent a rambling text, although there's some interesting insights about propaganda, but in reality, it sort of becomes the canonical text of Nazism. This is very important, partly because the sort of Nazi party doesn't have any intellectual figures. Now, if you define, therefore, what Nazi ideology is by writing a book such as Mein Kampf, ultimately, because there's no one else who determines what Nazism is, that gives you an authority ideologically and therefore politically over the party. And therefore, it's very important for that. You can also argue it's helpful for propaganda reasons, although in reality, most sales of Mein Kampf happen after Hitler comes to power. But it certainly isn't hurtful for that. He explains his Lebensraum, he advances anti-communism, and you'll notice a lot of the socialist aspects get removed. You can see even now Hitler is looking to sort of get the support of the elites. He only serves 9 months and is released for good behaviour as a result. So to summarise, therefore, if we look at the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch, on the surface it's an absolute failure. The NSDAP is banned, the SA is banned. Because Hitler is in prison, the natural split between the more socialist northern Berlin faction, led by the Strasser brothers, and the more southern Bavarian nationalists only gets wider. And by the time Hitler leaves prison, actually, it seems like they'll never be reconciled. Weimar economy and politics is improving, at least on the surface, as we've seen in previous lessons. And the Nazi ideas, in reality, don't really have a political program, at least until Mein Kampf comes along, and particularly one that is a program of a respectable group. The 25-point panel of its nationalizations is not going to get the support of many individuals. Likewise, it could be argued that Hitler, as a relatively new figure on the German political stage, hadn't really proved himself in this period. So they are the negatives. As mentioned, the positives are it does make Hitler a national name. It does also convince the Nazis, and particularly Hitler, to take a sort of more neutral stance, the sort of more political, sort of winning votes, political process, electoral stance, as opposed to violence, which, as we can see, has turned out. So the situation is, by the 1920s, relatively fluid. Hitler is charged with this minor party. He has got a bit of national profile, but he's part of a banned organisation. So what does he do? Well, first thing, he gets out of prison after 9 months and for good behaviour, and he very quickly gets the party legalised on the free speech grounds of the Weimar Constitution. And now in reality, part of this is also because the Nazi party seemingly is not a threat, so it doesn't really matter. his first job is to fix the party and turn it into one that's going to win elections. So if you're going to win elections, you need a few things. First things, you need money in order to campaign, etc. You need particularly in a party so divided as the Nazis, you need a central leader which determines policy, determines strategy, and everyone follows. This is because if you don't have that, then any message you give out will be diluted by the fact that other parts, your own party, contradict yourself. And as we've all seen in politics, whenever a party has multiple messages or quite publicly has disagreements, then it loses validity, it loses legitimacy. And if you're already a fringe party, this does not help you. So, for example, although parties have internal disagreements all the time, if you manage to keep it internal and if you manage to ultimately resolve it and come to a conclusion, therefore, then we would see, in reality, there is some success. As well as this, you need to make a party that has legit skilled people in positions of power. Likewise, you have an ability and an organisation on a national scale. At the moment, Nazis are limited to Bavaria and Berlin. And therefore, if you want to win elections, which the majority of Germany is not covered by that list, you need to make sure you have party members there, you have organisation there, you have the money to do that, you have the organisation, the office, and have a central HQ to organise these people, and you have individuals to fill those situations. So Hitler's mission is therefore to shift from a party of violence, in which the SA is more important, therefore, to a party and rebel rousing, to a party which has a structured organisation and it can win elections on a national scale. It needs to be funded, it needs to be organised, it needs to be unified, it needs to be disciplined, and it needs to be coherent. Now, already you can argue that the Mein Kampf helps his own personal power and therefore unity, and helps give a bit more coherence. But throughout the 1920s, we can argue we see a lot of Hitler's skills and strategy in unifying the party. So, obviously, we've got problems in the party in terms of the factions on the left. There's divisions all the way through. There is issues amongst the SA, who are increasingly undisciplined and unable to fight the more disciplined Red Camp fighters. You've got the poor ideology, and the Weimar Republic being relatively weakened. So therefore, what does he do? Well, number one, he uses the trial to gain mass media coverage, to become that national figure. So when he comes out of prison, he can start courting national conservative figures, gaining support from key individuals, and basically leveraging his fact he's a household name with his propaganda. No one knows who the Strasser brothers are, but people will know who Hitler is, or at least be reminded of Hitler is, and he'll be able to use that. He naturally uses his prison time to get Mein Kampf, which sells while the image of the Munich Putsch is fresh in people's brains. If he waited another 4 or 5 years, no one would have remembered him, but people breed it quite not, and that spreads the idea quite quickly. And once again, that particularly gives him a legitimacy and a control on the party, since he is the only one defining ideology, and therefore it's difficult to disagree with him as the pinnacle of Nazism, or if he says something is not the Nazi policy, it's difficult to disagree because he is the only one who comes up with Nazi policy. He is Nazi policy. You could argue the fact that Nazis are nationalistic and they are about authoritarianism means that people are more natural to obey, or naturally likely to obey in the Nazi party than any other political ideas, and that certainly helps him. And we can say, therefore, using this going forward is a starting point, and that time in Landsberg, that time in prison, is particular shifts in his ideas towards the ballot box. So you can argue in many ways the Munich Putsch was a failure in the short term, but led ultimately both in terms of giving Hitler the space to come up with a change in strategy, but also giving him the profile and the time to build an ideology in order to increase his awareness, increase his knowledge in the party, which then leads to the ultimate successful election of the Nazis. And therefore, we can say while the putsch failed in terms of the actual objectives of the putsch, it was a relative success in the long-term political effects. 10 years later, he will be the Chancellor of Germany. So what does he do? Number one, he decides to get control of the organisation. In 1926, there is a Bamberg Conference. The Bamberg Conference, if you know, is a conference designed to reunite the different factions of the party and give them a degree of unity. and established something called Führer principle. This is the idea that once the Führer, the leader, has said something, everyone must obey. Now, you can argue that to some extent this is easier in a Nazi party, which is all about obeying Führers, but still it's tricky because Hitler is associated with the Bavarian right wing, and the SA has a mind to be rebellious. However, in the Bamberg Conference, a couple of Hitler's key skills are on evidence. Number one, Bamberg is much closer to Bavaria than it is Berlin, and therefore we see many more Bavarian delegates, Bavarian representatives turned up than the Berlin ones. And although they both are invited equally, this means that the more conservative base have more votes in any crucial party debates. As well as that, Hitler is very good at looking at the leadership of the Berlin branch and picking them off one by one, usually in one-on-one meetings, and getting them on his side. So the classic example is Goebbels. Goebbels was a senior member of the Berlin faction, and he was quite hated Hitler at certain points. He wrote very poorly of Hitler at various points in his diaries beforehand, but he very much was under Hitler's spell from here on in. As well as this, he used his ability towards debate and more importantly, his speaking ability, unparalleled by anyone else in the party, to really drive people behind this. And people really commit to him as a leader, at least in theory. And he often, even though many people hate him as time goes on, people still follow that Führer principle just for long enough in order to see the party to victory. This is essential to get that unity, and as mentioned before, without that unity you cannot be a credible force, because how can you sell yourself to voters if you have two different messages and one wing of your party is going around beating up innocent people? No, you must have loyalty, you must have obedience, you must have discipline. As well as this, there's further organisation in the 1927 Nuremberg Conference, again down in the south, where each part of Germany is divided into Gau. These Gaus overlap with the electoral districts. Each leader, a Gauleiter, is chosen based on their loyalty to the party, breed that loyalty to Hitler, and commitment to the Nazi policies. However, each Gau is given flexibility to control their message in their own party. Now, this is very important. We mentioned this last time. Essentially, what things play well to the Nazi voters in Berlin are very different in Bavaria. Now, if you had one national poster, you'd either play well to one or the other, or you'll say something really vague and do neither. Gauleiters are the sort of middle ground. They can choose which aspects. They will never lie per se, but they will emphasize the aspects of Nazi policy which suit their particular base. So, for example, Bavarians will be very much on tradition, family, and anti-communism, whereas Berliners will be much on the socialist aspect of it. Nationalism in the east of Germany, whereas in the key towns it would be about recovery from the Treaty of Versailles. This allows a degree of individualization, therefore a shift towards a mass party. Now, many questions I get asked when we talk about this is, how comes people didn't know he was saying different things at different points? And the first thing to say is they would never really lie about Nazi policy. They never say they're pro-communist. I will never say they're sort of pro-church per se, but they'll just choose what they talk about very carefully and what they emphasize rather than what they criticize. And in addition to this, you have to remember that in this period, mass media is less of a thing, and any mass media appearance is very clearly controlled by Goebbels, who makes sure that none of this inconsistency is very evident. They do this by being very vague on any national scale. But as well as that, they are very helpful in order to sort of gain that sort of support from different groups who otherwise wouldn't be legitimized to Hitler. To allow that subdivision also allows a much better organization of for elections. Elections are generally, particularly in this period, won by people going around and canvassing. That's knocking door to door and talking to candidates, particularly for a party which no one's ever heard of and therefore won't vote for out of loyalty, like the Nazis. And the Gaus are responsible for local apparatus. This is very important for the Nazis, who up until a few years ago didn't even have anyone in most of Germany. These Gaus are therefore incredibly important administratively as well as ideologically to make sure the Nazi message is permeated at elections. It gets to the grassroots. This is essential going forward. Now, if people don't want to listen to your canvassers, then you can knock on all the doors in the world, and as we shall see in 1928, it will not succeed. However, when the situation, Great Depression, starts to change and people start to listen a little bit more, and then you have a perfect apparatus more advanced than anyone else in Germany to get your message out. And very quickly, your simple message, which people now want to hear, can get out. These Gauleiters are very important. As well as that, there's a massive increase in organisations. Germany, very interesting, is defined by adherence to organisations. Most parties have organisations. By having professional groups for doctors, lawyers, teachers, this is designed to give the Nazis a degree of legitimacy. But as well as that, it's designed to give these people who are very important in most small town communities, the local lawyer, the local doctor, local teacher, particularly local schoolmaster, very important in small towns and villages across Germany, which is the majority of Germany at this point. It gives these people a special active recruitment mechanism, and these people often commandeer a lot of respect from the rest of their community. It's designed to legitimize the Nazi Party, not simply amongst the middle classes, but deliberately target those who have influence elsewhere. They also set up welfare organizations, for example soup kitchens, and develop a network of support. So what we see is a diversifications on their action, particularly targeting groups which are important or impressionable. Hitler Youth being impressionable, doctors, lawyers, teachers seen as being important in the community to lend a degree of legitimacy to Nazi regime. Remember, this is only 4 years after they did a coup. Propaganda massively increases. Goebbels joins the party. He's not the propaganda minister, head of propaganda straight away, but he, in all names and purposes, is. And the various members who are propaganda before him are just placeholders, and he is the power behind the throne. Nuremberg is the first war rally where we see propaganda. We'll talk about propaganda in much more detail later when we talk about Hitler coming to power. The important thing about propaganda, though, it's about getting a message and branding yourself. When people think about Nazis, what do they think of your core issues are? Goebbels is very, very good at that. He doesn't seek to persuade. He seeks to sell the Nazis as X, Y, or Z, and he's very good at that and getting control of a message, so that when people think, oh, Hitler, when they think of Nazis, a party they have no preconceptions about, they're able to sort of have a relatively positive view towards him. Part of that, though, as Goebbels' genius is to keep it vague. He very rarely gives specific policies. It is about work. It's about anti-treaty of Versailles. There's all the what, none of the how or where or when or why. As well as that, in 1925, Hitler sets up the SS. These are personal bodyguards who aren't the SA. Now, initially, they will be part of the SA, but they will be deliberately kept different. They wear different uniforms, they have different leadership, and their leadership is directly linked to Hitler. It is a personal bodyguard, but by 1929, when Himmler comes in charge, and this is a man we're going to see a lot of as time goes on, when he comes in charge, he will turn it into something massive. Now, obviously, it's important to have a bodyguard, etc. But the most important thing here is the SS will be a counterweight to the SA. The SA is big, but it's undisciplined and unwieldy and all divided up and very disorganized and not necessarily that effective. The SS is the opposite. It's small, but it's incredibly loyal, incredibly organized, works incredibly hard, and therefore is designed to stop the SA simply telling and threatening, directly or indirectly, the Nazi leadership what to do. So if your bodyguards are the same people who want you to do something, obviously that's quite threatening. The Praetorian Guards in Rome, for example, are an example of bodyguards who eventually just controlled all the power. The SS are that. They are designed to counterweight the SA power, which is increasingly seen as quite threatening as time goes on. So, if we are going to look at the summary of what's happened in this period, yes, Hitler's done speeches, but the most important thing is Hitler is building an electoral apparatus, one with money, and we haven't mentioned actually, Hitler's increasingly made contacts with members of the industrial elite. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the elites and Hitler coming to power, but it's well worth bearing in mind most of the contacts amongst the elite happened in this period. He builds up the propaganda, which we'll go more into detail in the propaganda section, and he builds up the apparatus, most importantly, the machine to run a party on a mass national scale, something which did not exist in 1924-25. And we can argue, therefore, that he has been very successful. However, if you look at the election 1928, it was on the surface very, very, very disappointing. The Nazis secured 92.6% of the votes. They only got 12 seats in the Reichstag, and therefore this argument of legality did not seem to be working. And there are many on the left who started to say going back to violence made sense. And therefore, the Nazis almost seem like, to quote, a fringe irritant. And on the surface, therefore, because they only got such a limited amount of votes, we can crudely say, well, they weren't successful. Naturally, though, we're going for the NA star, so we want to say that actually they were successful. In terms of winning votes, they weren't successful. But as we know from the previous lessons, this is because the 1920s, of particularly the golden era, as it's known as, or the golden age, as it's known, is one where the sort of Germany is doing well, and therefore there's little excuse or reason for people to be turning to extreme parties. What Hitler is doing, therefore, is he's building up a base of support, a mechanism, a structure of support, which when a crisis comes, now he doesn't know what crisis, he doesn't know when, he's maybe not even thinking on these lines, but he's built something of when the Great Depression comes, he can almost instantaneously gain support in ways other parties can have. Say if he didn't do any of this, say if he just kept having a split party, he didn't have a national apparatus, he didn't have much money, and he didn't have a disciplined organisation, and then the Great Depression happened, there's nothing to suggest that he would have been able to exploit that. How would he have got a message across? How would he have told areas outside of Munich and outside of Berlin? How would people listen to the central thing? The core behind the scenes work has been done. So the successes in this period, obviously we can say this, membership increases. Yes, there's signs that the rural population in northern Germany and middle classes, the more rural population in particular, is put off by the rural agricultural depression that's happening since 1926. And we can point out that this is supported by the fact in 1929 state elections, areas of the rural areas such as Thuringia already have higher votes, 11.3% of elsewhere, and it shows therefore the Nazis will do well when they exploit difficult economic times. But for me, the biggest success, they build an apparatus. This is a long-term, slow grow. You can't build a national party out of nowhere. And I would argue, therefore, the mid-20s, 24 to 28, almost unparalleled in the effectiveness of Hitler to build this system. And it really comes back to Hitler as a leader. One of the paragraphs we're going to be looking at is how far was Hitler responsible for the rise, for the successes of the Nazis or him coming to power. And a crude thing, as we shall see, people do is they say Hitler is a speaker. He's a good speaker, and that's why he gets power. Actually, the smart thing to say is Hitler is a political leader. Hitler's ability to build a party apparatus, and as we shall see in the 1930s, hold it together is what wins them the election and wins them power. This is your evidence. This reorganization, everything from Bamberg to Nuremberg to SS to Goebbels, the reorganization of party shows a skill both in how he did it and the fact that he knew to do it in the first place. That is our skill, and that was what I want us to focus on. After the election, one last thing to talk about is the anti-Young Plan campaign. Alfred Hugenberg, the head of the NVP and the owner of several large conservative papers, pushes for a referendum to challenge the Young Plan. The Young Plan is designed to limit the amount the German economy has to pay in reparations for war debts as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So why is that bad? But people on the right, like Hugenberg, saw this as an acceptance of the basis of the Treaty of Versailles. They argued it'd be better to sort of almost ignore the repayments because that would suggest that the Treaty of Versailles is illegitimate and that the Germans won't abide by it. Now, in reality, this allows Hitler to gain a greater respectability. Hugenberg is desperate to make this look like a legitimate popular movement of the right and therefore gain more support, rather than this a DMVP election, which only about 12 to 20% of people will vote for. He therefore brings a lot of time and effort bringing lots of people from other right-wing parties, including Hitler, and therefore gives Hitler, because obviously all these additional parties will get very good glowing references from Hugenberg's conservative papers, this gives Hitler an opportunity to get a national profile. And the anti-Young Plan campaign actually fails. They don't get anywhere near the votes. It was always going to fail. But again, it introduces Hitler as a legitimate party to people who read the right-wing papers of Hugenberg, natural supporters. So again, it helps build up Hitler's ability to build up a contract, the contacts with Hugenberg, Hitler's luck, obviously, that Hugenberg was happening to do this at the same time, but also the fact that Hitler built a party legitimate enough for Hugenberg to consider associating with shows how far he's come, okay, and therefore proves himself a powerful speaker and makes himself really, for the first time, common knowledge, or at least relatively common knowledge, amongst sections of the right-wing elite. So let's summary. What does he achieve? He is a failure in terms of electoral success. Obviously, the Nazis do not gain votes, does not gain in this period. However, the core of the party, what the Nazi ideology means, has developed. Not only has it become more robust and more sophisticated and more explained and more logical in terms of like it's in one set place, although the arguments are not necessarily logical. It also, however, becomes more legitimate to electoral base. No one's going to vote for a 25-point fan with its nationalisation, whereas Hitler has crafted an ideological core, which always adapts, but crafted a core which is far more votable. And this is very important to winning elections. He's made the party legal again. He has switched the ballot box policy of winning elections rather than by force, which is fundamental. He's managed to patch up, if not fix, the split in the party. And without fixing that, there's no way you can have a credible election. As we shall see, he just about keeps the party together. They're constantly causing problems, but he manages it. He reins in the SA, gets them to follow him by Führerprinzip. He balances them with the SS. He gets the loyalty of Rom. He established Führerprinzip, as we mentioned, essential for obedience and loyalty. Very important when you've got a split. Establishes the Gauleiter system. He also, I haven't mentioned, establishes the central Nazi party headquarters, basically a funded and full-time administrative body designed to run the party. You cannot have a national party without that, because how do people get paid? How do you get the right people in the right place? How do you do fundraising? How do you organise messages? How do you organise all those Gauleiters? The central HQ administration is often missed out, but just as important. As you mentioned, he establishes the SS, he establishes a formal propaganda arm, which very quickly Goebbels puts in, and he develops his national profile and a relationship with the main conservative party, which is the DNVP. So therefore, he has built the start of a very effective national electoral force. Is it perfect yet? Absolutely not. Is it getting there? Absolutely. And that's the key message here. From this starting point, from this launch pad, he cannot win elections, as is seen by 1928. But with the right issue, he can develop very quickly a national party, because the mechanism to win elections is there. The system is there, the unity is there, the ideology is there, everything is there. Hitler will not change his ideology massively between 1928 and 1930, but people will vote in droves, and that's because in reality it's not the ideology, it's because people want to hear it. The mechanism he's given, from the Gauleiters to the unity of purpose to the Führerprinzip to the propaganda, allows him to present the message as he needs to in order to win votes. Thank you very much. We'll be looking now onto far more each pretty much next few lessons are potential factors in explaining the rise to Hitler. I believe we're looking at the Great Depression next. Until then, I'll see you